All right. I know people are getting their lunch, but we're going to try to get started so we can get in all of the material we want to talk about. So a couple of things today. We are extremely fortunate. The title today is Congress and Crypto, What Happens Now? I don't know how many of you are closely following the crypto world. There have been a few events in the last few days. And so this is probably about as timely an event as we could have as a center. We have two speakers with us today, two people that are extremely knowledgeable and capable in this area. Howell Jackson is the first, and Howell is the James Reed Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. And his research interests are generally financial regulation, consumer protection, international finance, and federal budget policy. He did spend 2 years, 2013 to 2015, as a visiting scholar at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He edits a number of journals, for example, the SSRN Regulation of Financial Institutions e-journal. He's written 3 books, Financial Regulation, Law and Policy, Analytic Methods for Lawyers, and Regulation of Financial Institutions, all of which are about as timely as you could imagine at this point, given events occurring. He was also a law clerk for Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court, and he did go to Brown as an undergraduate, but we won't hold that against him because he does have a JD and an MBA from Harvard. And then the other person is Tim Massad. And I don't know, some of you have been at Tim's sessions before, but Tim was the former chairman of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission in the Obama administration. He's currently a research fellow here at the Massad Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and he's also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown. The other thing I want to mention is he was Assistant Secretary for Financial Stability at the U.S. Department of the Treasury in the first Obama administration, and in that role, he was overseeing TARP. I worry that students get younger and younger while I get older and older. Yeah. I don't know if you remember the financial crisis of 2008, but Tim oversaw TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which was basically the U.S.'s significant and most extensive response to the financial crisis. He was at Treasury from 2009 to 2014. Before that, he was a partner, and I don't know how many of you are knowledgeable about law firms, but he was a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore, which is one of the best law firms, I think, in the world. I interacted with them in my prior life when I was running AT&T's international operations. And he does have a BA from Harvard and a JD from Harvard, so he's true crimson all the way through. So I will turn it over to the two of them to lead us through this very, very interesting topic, given everything going on.
Great. Thank you, John. Howell's going to start. We thought it would be helpful to give a few minutes overview of crypto regulation today, which some of you may know a little bit about, but Howell, I think, can explain it better than probably anyone I know. And then I'll talk a little bit about the legislative outlook in terms of what might happen next, and then we'll kind of maybe Howell will chime in on that, and then we'll take your questions.
Great. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, John. And I don't know, John, if you mentioned that Tim is also heading up the digital assets policy program here, of which I think we're sort of apart right now, but it's a great set of things that are going on at Harvard right now, thanks to Tim's energy and leadership.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that. It's my failing that I didn't advertise a little bit more for the center and for the law school and for the business school. We have created, I co-direct the center with Larry Summers. We decided this was an important enough issue that we should have a program within the center. We created the Digital Assets Policy Program. Tim had some thoughts about this initially, and he was kind enough to come and be the director of that program. The faculty chairs of the program are Howell, Larry Summers, and Robin Greenwood from the business school. So, thank you for reminding me.
Well, and there'll be more events coming. So as Tim said, I'm going to talk about the current regulatory structure just to get you oriented. And as we were joking coming in, I have the easy part because nothing changed this morning with respect to the history of financial regulation. But things did happen this morning that Tim is going to talk about and for the past couple of days that might have a bearing on what happens next. But so let me just say a little bit about the regulation of crypto and digital assets, as I sometimes prefer to say, since it's maybe a bit more embracing term. The short answer is it's complicated, what's going on. One of the reasons it's complicated is that we have a very complicated regulatory structure in the United States that some of you may be aware of. There are a lot of boxes. We have banking regulators, we have securities regulators, we have insurance regulators, we have regulators at the federal level, we have regulators at the state level. And even if you get into a sector like capital markets, we aren't satisfied with one regulator. We have two with the SEC and then the CFTC, which Tim headed up. So we have a highly fragmented regulatory system. And along comes digital assets, which are also in many flavors. We start with Bitcoin, as we must, but there are many other kinds of digital currencies, Ether, Ripple, there are ICOs, there are distributed autonomous organizations, many other kinds of digital assets. And so in some sense, it's not locating a single thing in this regulatory structure, it's locating a number of things. And we also have a history. If you go back to 2008 with the white paper about Bitcoin, it comes along and it's not obvious what it is. There's not an issuer, there's not even a person who we can identify clearly individually, but there is this protocol on the internet and we need to classify it. And so actually it's great to have Tim here because Tim did some classifying early on in 2014 or so, basically saying he was pretty sure that a future on Bitcoin was something that he at the CFTC should be thinking about because it was bouncing around like a lot of other futures. And if that's right, then Bitcoin must be a commodity because he's the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. So he exercised jurisdiction over the futures, and that's something that he really regulates. He has a little bit of responsibility for the what we call the spot market, the cash market, the current market, because if someone messes around with the spot market, they're going to sort of indirectly mess around with the futures market. But the main operation, the regulatory side of things, the oversight is of the futures market, and that's what Tim did, which left the SEC kind of out of the Bitcoin business. And Jay Clayton, who was strong on other kinds of digital assets, basically conceded, and the SEC has conceded, that this thing is not a not a security for purposes of his work. And the question about whether other digital currencies like Ether or Ripple would be securities or not kind of was left open, and in some sense still remains open. What the SEC did decide, though, is another kind of digital asset, which is the DAO, the Distributed Autonomous Organization. At least the variant that came to its attention in 2017 was a security, because when he looked at it, he applied something known as the Howell test, which comes from a court decision in the 1940s about orange groves. But the Supreme Court decided that if you invest money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profits solely from the efforts of others, that is going to constitute a security, because that's one of the things, an investment contract, that's listed in the definition of securities. And so the SEC kind of worked through, there was an investment by giving a token. There were a lot of people that were making the investment, so there was commonality. They hoped to get profits, and all of the work was being done by the organizers, the Socket group in Switzerland, that were kind of finding projects and distributing things to investors, or at least that's what they proposed to do. And that made it into a security and brought it into the SEC's bailiwick. So some digital assets are securities. There was a footnote that some digital assets might not be securities if you were just kind of prepaying for a product, kind of like when you go and buy a car and you put down a down payment. That's not a security. But other DAOs ICOs were securities. And so the path was set for this regulatory structure where we have securities digital assets like the DAO. We have other digital assets that may or may not be securities. Then we have things that Tim is having oversight of because they have derivatives trading on them. And that's, of course, where we put Bitcoin after the 2014 division. So that's so much is that is clear that there are some securities digital assets and some that are not. But this line that I put in red is a little blurred. We don't totally know what's included. And we sometimes refer to this as, the spot market of other digital assets that don't have a derivative attached to them, so Tim and his successors can get at them. And so what happens? Well, there are a lot of enforcement actions. Some Ether-type cryptocurrencies, the SEC takes the view of that they are securities. And so when someone like Kim Kardashian tweets about them, they're tweeting about a security and they can get into trouble with the SEC. And in fact, she did. She had to pay some money, $2 million. There's also those other cryptocurrencies, like Ripple I mentioned, not so clear. Jay Clayton, on the last day in office practically, decides that actually Ripple's XRP is a security and should be registered with the SEC. Ripple, which has been in business now for many years, doesn't like that. They say sue me, and the SEC does. It's in court, lots of filing, ongoing question. Then we have the CFTC gets into the business. They're kind of looking at some things that should be, in their view, registered and trading on registered exchanges. So there's kind of some arguments about leveraged transactions that might be considered to be derivatives. Coinbase, which is an FTX-like exchange platform of cryptocurrencies, not registered with the SEC as an exchange, but finds itself being sued because some of its employees are trading on inside information. That's only of interest to the SEC if there's a security with inside information. That means Bitcoin should be registered with the SEC, but Bitcoin is not registered with the SEC. That's kind of a contradiction. We can talk about the Bored Ape if you want to. That's an NFT. I don't even know what that is, but it may be a security that's going on there. And then off in the background, there's OFAC, which is worried about money laundering. And they have another angle on this that's not securities-based. It's based on if you were a money transmitter and if you were kind of washing North Korean stolen digital assets, that's of concern to them. And so they sanction a mixer of virtual tokens relatively recently and put it essentially out of business. Okay, so those are enforcement actions. A little bit what's going on, I would say, is there's kind of a dispute about where this line is. And the SEC is pushing it to the right. They're arguing, and Gary Gensler is very clearly associated with pushing this to the right. Interestingly, though, at least as of when I left my office, none of the major exchanges and none of the major players in the digital asset space are registering with the SEC. So they're kind of taking the position, as a policy matter, the SEC's rules don't work for digital assets because custody is complicated and different. The way they do business is different. Their business models meld things together that the SEC would want to have separate or at least segmented in some way. It's not the right model for them. They think they are not involved with securities, I suppose, but they also have friends in Congress who want the internet to be free, and they think it's possible that maybe they can tough Gary Gensler out. And before he can win in court, and I would say, you know, I'm a law professor, I have to say something. I think Gensler has the better view for many of these digital assets being securities. It's not a layup. The people who design these things try to design them to not be securities, but a lot of them are using them to raise money, which would be the hallmark of securities. But it's not obvious. And so you can litigate, as Ripple has, and you can wait for compromise. And there's a lot of stuff going on in Congress and around the agencies. And this is where we're going to be talking about the future. So I'm going to sort of turn it over to Tim now. But there's things that might be done with the CFTC and their SROs. There are things that might be done at the banking level. I haven't talked about banks before, but some of these digital assets like stablecoins maybe should have bank type regulation. The Biden administration put out a report about a year ago, sort of saying that was the right direction to go in. There's some legislation on that, but there's a report. There's state level regulation going on a lot of these things that maybe isn't so great, but maybe could be improved. Whether it should exist in parallel to a federal scheme is sort of an interesting question. And there's also questions about the money laundering stuff and how it's applied that we may or may not get into. And finally, we should say there's stuff going on offshore. There are other places that are kind of further along with the United States in regulating innovation and payments and you know, digital assets. You know, that's a criterion we need to think about, because moving offshore is a possibility. If we are too stringent, we need to think about, you know, how we coordinate in the world in this area. So these are all problems that Tim is going to tell you how Congress is going to resolve them. But that's the current state of play.
Okay. All right. So when Howell and I first talked about doing this, we said, well, let's do something on crypto policy and how regulation might change. And why don't we do it right after the midterms? Because that would just be a good time. It would be a good hook, if you will, because we can pontificate on, you know, what we think the midterms mean for this. And in point of fact, of course, our timing was great, but not for the reasons we thought. It was great because we've had these FTX events in the last few days. How many of you, just so I know, how many of you are familiar with this saga that has been playing out over the last few days about FTX? Just so I can get a sense, because I'll say a little bit about it for the benefit of those who but let me just first talk about, let's leave that aside for the moment and just talk about generally, where are we in Congress? And I would say there is a growing interest in crypto and a growing focus on it, and a sense that maybe we need to do something more about it. The industry, of course, has been crying out for clarity to regulation and so forth for years, but there is a lot more interest in Congress today than a year ago, or certainly 3 years ago, but a great variety of views. The Biden administration has recently issued several reports. And what happened was the Biden administration issued an executive order in March that was titled Ensuring Responsible Development of Digital Assets. And it called for an across-the-government approach to how we should be thinking about digital assets meaning crypto like Bitcoin, stable coins, but also central bank digital currencies and the technologies that underneath them. Now, of course, the idea of an across-the-government approach is a great idea, but we're not China, and we don't really do across-the-government coherent approaches very well. We have trouble passing budgets even. So this was admirable. We'll see what happens. In any event, they did issue a lot of reports, a lot of very good reports describing the market. But I would say, with respect to crypto, at least, meaning Bitcoin, Ethereum, other tokens, stable coins, they evidence a lot of skepticism about this industry, a lot of concern about the risks, far more than they evidence a sense of potential about the innovation. And they do call for greater regulation, in some cases, very specific recommendations on regulation I'll get to. So then you've got the industry getting much more politically active, contributing to congressional races, speaking out. And of course, the prime example of that, of the person who spoke out, has been Sam Bankman-Fried, who's the head of FTX. Let me digress for a moment to tell you about FTX for those of you who haven't followed it. FTX is one of the largest exchanges, and I use the word exchange with some reservation. A lot of people don't like to use the word exchange when it comes to crypto, because exchanges in the legal, or at least in our parlance in the US, mean something that's registered, complies with SEC or CFTC rules and so forth. These exchanges aren't really subject to a framework. Nevertheless, they are trading platforms. So Sam Bankman-Fried, a young man, he's about 30 years old, was a trader, and then got into crypto, and basically over the course of a couple of years built one of the largest exchanges out there and became a billionaire. At one point his wealth was estimated to be 30 billion. I think now it's 15 billion. Not bad at age 30. But he has become, or he has been until recently, a spokesman calling for greater regulation of the industry, saying this would help. He's got offshore operations and US operations. Well, all of a sudden, over the last week, his offshore operations basically are on the verge of collapse. It's unclear exactly why. The facts will come out fully, I'm sure, over the next several weeks. But there were connections between the exchange and the firm that Mr. Bankman-Fried originally started, called Alameda Research, which is a trading operation, a market-making operation. And there were transactions between those two, or allegedly transactions between those two, that may have involved, we don't know, but may have involved improper loans of customer assets. And then posting of collateral that was essentially not worth very much because it was collateral in the form of a token that FTX issued, called FTT. In any event, there were suddenly a great increase in withdrawals from the FTX exchange, people wanting their money back. On top of that, the head of what is the largest crypto exchange, Binance, a man called CZ Peng, again, an offshore exchange, had made an investment in FTX that he was holding in the form of this FTT, this token that FTX issued. He decided, he made an announcement that he was going to sell that because, he needed to really just get out of that position. He was no longer kind of working with Sam. And there was also kind of a Twitter war between the two of them, where, CZ basically alleged that Sam was making derogatory comments about other exchanges. Sam may have been doing that in the context of calling for more regulation. Anyway, a lot of nastiness going on. CZ's action then probably propelled the concerns about FTX. Then it really looked like FTX was going under. CZ then said he would buy FTX, but that was a non-binding offer. CZ then withdrew that offer, and that's kind of where we are right now. So stay tuned. In any event, that is going to affect what happens in Congress more than the midterms. Okay, the midterms have resulted in the Republicans taking control of the House, not by as much as they thought. That will obviously cause changes in committee leadership, and it will have some effect. But I think this episode and how it plays out will have a much bigger effect, and we'll talk and get your views on that too. In any event, when you look at Congress generally, many Republicans, I would say, there are lots of different views, but I think more Republicans than Democrats kind of lean into the innovative potential of the industry, and they worry about regulation crimping that and causing that activity to move offshore. And so they want to make sure regulation does not have too heavy a hand. Many Democrats, on the other hand, focus on the risks, the lack of consumer protection. Some of them I think, basically take the view that we want to prevent crypto from having interconnections with the traditional financial system, because that's really what caused the risk. We want to sort of keep it out there. And many people, I think, in the executive branch today feel the same way. There were even those in the Trump administration executive branch who felt the same way. I remember talking to people at Treasury in 2018 when I was working on a paper that said we need to improve regulation. And they said, well, you know, if we call for that, it might just legitimize this industry too much. So they didn't even want to go there. So that's kind of where we are. Now, what does the FTX collapse mean? Well, for one thing, I think this will end up being more significant than even what happened in the spring when we had an algorithmic stablecoin called Terra Luna collapse. It will be more significant than what happened in the pandemic when prices suddenly dropped. This is a big event because Sam was so outspoken about wanting reform, and because, at least the allegations are, Sam was doing a lot of things that regulation would presumably prohibit, and just the prominence of him and the size of the operation. And it clearly underscores the need for greater regulation. We don't have transparency with these platforms. We don't have rules that prevent the kinds of conflicts of interest that we long ago prevented with traditional securities exchanges or derivatives exchanges. If you buy and sell equity stocks, you don't worry about the NYSE front running your trade, right? Which means knowing that you're going to trade, but before you trade, they take advantage of that in some way. None of us perhaps make big enough trades for that to make a difference. But if you did make big enough trades and someone could front run you, you would not want that. You don't worry about FTX, trading against you generally. You don't worry about FTX having an interest in some equity security that you might want to buy without you knowing that. Lots of conflicts like that. We don't have rules about that for crypto. We don't have rules that protect customer funds. If the NYSE were to fail, unlikely, but if it were, we have an insurance scheme that's basically set up. And if your broker, more importantly, if your broker were to fail, we have an insurance scheme that's set up that basically protects you. And in the derivatives world, we have special bankruptcy rules that protect you. We don't have that. And as Howell said, even the notion of custody is more complicated with crypto. So if a crypto exchange were to fail and it was holding your crypto, right, which many can do, not clear what happens, not clear how you get that back. So lots and lots of issues because the basic regulatory framework we have today, other than with respect to crypto exchanges that are trading derivatives on crypto, that's different. But for the spot market, in other words, when you just go to buy Bitcoin for cash, we don't have a federal regulator of that, as Howell said. And these entities are licensed at the state level under what's called money transmitter laws that really don't impose much in the way of obligations. So this event, however it plays out, will underscore the need for stronger regulation. Clearly undermines Sam Bankman-Fried as a spokesperson, but exactly how it plays out is still unclear. So it's hard to say today, is this going to speed things up or slow things down? I'm not sure at the moment. Why do I say that? Well, I think there's going to be those people who are skeptical about crypto, really skeptical about crypto, will say, well, this just shows we got to make sure we don't do anything that legitimizes it. We got to make sure it's walled off from the traditional financial system. There will be those who will say, yeah, but that doesn't really work. So we do need to move forward with regulation. And then, of course, there's lots of people who don't understand it at all, and that makes it hard to just build consensus. So we will see. So what are the issues that Congress is facing? Well, first is regulation of stablecoins. Stablecoins are those crypto tokens that whose value is tied to something, right? Whose value, the most common ones, their value is tied to the dollar, meaning one token equals $1. And they maintain that price, or try to maintain that price, by when you buy a token, they take your reserves and they ideally invest those in a very conservative way, so that you know that if you go to redeem that, you're going to get your dollar back. There is not really a clear framework for those. And some people say, well, gee, aren't those kind of like money market funds where they're taking your money, and gee, we could have a run on those just like we had runs on money market funds, financial crisis, and almost in the pandemic. The difference is they're not really investment options today. You don't get interest on a stable coin. If you got interest, it clearly would be much more like a money market fund. But the way the big ones work is they don't pay interest. So what Congress does about stablecoins is a big thing. I'll come back to stablecoins. Second issue is regulatory oversight of the spot market, which Howell talked about for the non-security tokens. The third big issue is just the lack of regulatory clarity, and I'll talk about that. Fourth issue that might come up is central bank digital currencies. So let's talk about those. So stablecoins. So here's a chart of stablecoin market capitalization. You can see they dramatically increased. And why is that? That's because they play a very valuable function in the crypto universe. If you want to buy and sell crypto tokens, and there's thousands of them that you could trade, you need to pay for that, right? Unlike when you purchase a stock or a bond, you have to settle that trade the minute you make it, right? With stocks and bonds, there's a delay. You may still have to pre-fund your brokerage account, but technically there is a delay between executing that order and paying for it. With crypto, there's not. So you either have to have your cash at a centralized exchange already, but if you want to trade on a decentralized platform, you can't wire money, you can't use a Visa card, you've got to have another token, right? You're trading one token for another, you use a stablecoin. Stablecoins have powered the growth of DeFi because they're a very useful tool. They allow you to trade, to move value from one platform to another, to move value from one token to another instantly. And a lot of people have said then, well, gee, maybe they could have application elsewhere too. Maybe they could help us improve our payments. Maybe they could speed up cross-border payments. So shouldn't we have a regulatory framework for them? So the skeptics see risk because they worry about there being runs on these things. Other people see opportunities. What are the risks? Well, you could have a run. If the stablecoin issuer doesn't invest the reserves carefully and loses money, and then you have a lot of people demanding redemption, you could have a run. You have the problem that this would not be a conventional bankruptcy, or this would not be like a bank failure, right? When a bank fails, what happens? The FDIC steps in, your deposit is insured, you get your money, someone probably takes it over, life goes on. This would be more like a normal bankruptcy where there's a trustee and there's what's called the automatic stay, and everybody stands in line waiting for this whole mess to be sorted out, and you as a token holder might not get your money back for years. You also have a lot of operational risks. Stablecoins once are issued by an entity, but then they trade on decentralized blockchains. What's the resilience of those blockchains? What's the reliability of those blockchains? Could there be hacks? Could there simply be bugs, software bugs? You have the problems of potential illicit activity because of the way those are traded. Could they be traded to a bad actor? What are the procedures on decentralized blockchain to prevent that, to prevent money laundering? And finally, who should be allowed to issue these? Should we allow Amazon to have its own stablecoin, use all that customer data that it has from its sales to do this? Facebook tried to launch a stablecoin, it was shut down. So we have a lot of questions about sort of commercial affiliation, concentration of power, privacy, use of data. On the other hand, there is opportunity potentially. Maybe they could improve cross-border payments. Maybe they could help with financial inclusion. Maybe they could help with competition in payments generally. So there's lots of bills pending in Congress. The Biden administration has given out its views. It's basically said, okay, look, we should limit the issuers of stablecoins to basically regulated banks, insured depository institutions. They've softened that a little bit to say, well, maybe there's some flexibility. Maybe they can sort of be what we call narrow banks. In other words, entities subject to banking supervision, but maybe they don't have to meet all the banking rules. There was a recent report of what's called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which kind of hinted at that. There's lots of legislative proposals on this right now. Waters McHenry, so Maxine Waters is the Democratic chair today of the House Financial Services Committee, one of the most important committee in the House. And Patrick McHenry is the ranking Republican member. He will become the chair of that committee. They have a proposal to regulate stablecoins. Two senators, Senator Lummis from Wyoming and Senator Gillibrand from New York, have it. They teamed up. Again, one Republican, one Democrat, and also one is on the Senate Banking Committee, one is on the Senate Agriculture Committee. That's important because those two committees have jurisdiction respectively over the SEC and the CFTC. They have a measure that not only addresses stablecoins, it addresses a lot of other things in crypto. Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania is retiring, has a measure, as does Representative Gottheimer. So the key issues in this debate will be what type of entities can issue stablecoins. Should it just be banks? Should it be broader than banks? Should we allow for state as well as federal chartering on this? How do we deal with this, all these risks pertaining to decentralized blockchains? In many ways, dealing with the run risk, what we call the prudential risk, is easier. We kind of know how to do that. You keep the reserves in cash and treasury securities. Maybe you even deposit them at the Federal Reserve, right? So we know how to deal with those prudential risks. The operational risks on the blockchain, in some ways, is much harder. How to deal with this question of commercial affiliations. So, and how to deal with privacy and use of data. So lots of issues there. There was some hope that Congress in the lame duck section might actually pass something. I don't think we've totally given up on that, but it's, I would say, unlikely given the situation. But this could be an area where we see movement. And of course, then we have offshore stablecoins that wouldn't necessarily be subject to any of this. How do we deal with that? The biggest stablecoin today is Tether, which is offshore and is less regulated than even the US ones. Okay, issue number 2 is jurisdiction over the spot market. Again, this would be the spot market, meaning when you go to buy Bitcoin or Ethereum for cash. So it's the spot market for those crypto assets that aren't securities. And as Howell said, that line as to which are securities and which are not, we don't know exactly where that falls. Gary Gensler would say most of what's out there is a security. A lot of people in the industry would say most of what's out there is not a security. So they're fighting over that. But we do know that there's no federal regulator for the spot market for stuff that's not a security. So there's an increasing recognition of the need to address that. Again, this FSOC report calls for legislation to address that. There's a couple of bills that would address that. Now, here's where the FTX thing comes in. The Stabenow-Boozman legislation would basically just address this problem. The Lummis-Gillibrand legislation addresses this problem, plus stablecoins, plus some tax issues, plus some other stuff. In some sense, in one way, you could say, well, gee, it's more comprehensive. Isn't that better? But sometimes that's harder to get through Congress. Stabenow-Boozman would just do this legislation. But Sam Bankman-Fried was kind of identified with this legislation. He was seen as a supporter of it. In Washington, the narrative is, more important than all the facts, right? So it'll be very interesting to see now if this legislation is not liked as much because Sam was identified with it, or if people say, well, gee, the collapse of FTX really shows we need this.
So Tim, on this point, we haven't had a chance to talk this personally. The Stabenow legislation, if it were adopted, would address this problem. It would land the solution at your old desk for the most part.
Right.
Gary Gensler's desk would be emptier than it currently is.
Right.
He's been out there fighting the good fight. While Sam Bankman-Fried may be the loser of the week, it's conceivable that Gary Gensler is the winner of the week. So
Is the winner of the week because of what happened.
because of what
Yeah,
happened.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. And, the other thing I think to say about this legislation is it addresses the problem, but maybe not as comprehensively as you'd like, especially after what's happened. When you read it, it doesn't today, if you were to write this legislation, you'd be loading it up with 15 things, 15 principles that these exchanges have to follow. Well, the legislation doesn't really do that. That's why I think it's not gonna, I don't see it getting passed now in its current form, but we'll see. The industry supports a lot of, I shouldn't say the industry. Some of the industry supported the idea of the CFTC as a regulator of the spot market instead of the SEC. Why was that? Well, you could say, the good interpretation or the nice interpretation would be, well, the SEC, the CFTC understands commodities, and these are really more like commodities. Maybe. Some people would say, well, it's because the CFTC is a smaller agency, it has a much smaller budget, and its leadership has not been nearly as aggressive as Gary Gensler at the SEC. So we'd rather have the CFTC. And of course, this is what I say to the CFTC chairman who supported this legislation. Be careful what you wish for, because if he gets this authority, but he doesn't get the resources, boy, that's to me almost the worst place to be as a regulator. Let me quickly talk about the lack of regulatory clarity and the CBDC issue, and then how can, and then we'll take your questions or Hal wants to add to what I said. So then there's this issue that the industry loves to talk about, which is the lack of regulatory clarity. There's a lack of regulatory clarity when it comes to crypto. We don't know what the rules are, and that is hurting U.S. Citizens who want to get involved in this. It limits investment. We need clarity. And of course, this is sometimes focused on this security versus commodity issue. Sometimes people say, well, it's just we don't have rules on custody. We just don't have clear rules. We don't have clear guidance. Some of the proposals attempt to address this in ways that, frankly, I fear would probably create more uncertainty or less clarity, because it's kind of difficult to legislate things like this, I think. Personally think the complexity of this issue makes it unlikely that Congress will take action on this, and that there are pending SEC enforcement actions, as Howell referred to, that will affect this issue, such as the lawsuit against Ripple. They've got another one involving a Coinbase employee who was accused of insider trading, and they're arguing that things he traded were securities. So my own view is this issue is not as ripe for legislative action, but we may hear a lot of talk about it. Republicans, particularly in the House now, and if they get control of the Senate, they may seek to influence it through oversight of the SEC. But again, all that could sort of be tempered by what happens with FTX. They may not be as willing to kind of, say to Gary Gensler, oh, you're being too aggressive. So that tune could really change. I think I wrote that line before FTX happened.
Right. There was a story in one of the trade presses about using appropriation riders, which is something that the House could do, to say, Gary Gensler, you can't use any of the money we give you to go after Ripple, name whatever. And that, if especially if the Republican control the House, that would be available to them.
Right.
If the politics were right.
Yeah.
But maybe not.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Finally, on central bank digital currencies, there will be some interesting things that happening here. The Attorney General has to opine on whether the Fed has the authority and provide a legislative proposal, if it doesn't, on how to create a central bank digital currency. We've had the Fed issue a report basically saying, we don't know, we're going to study it. We're not going to do it unless Congress tells us we have that authority. A lot of people that follow this space think the U.S. isn't doing as much as it should. But there is a diversity of views in Congress as well as at the Fed. There are governors at the Fed who think we don't need a central bank digital currency. This is stupid. We've got a good payment system. There are ways that we're working on improving it, and there's no point to a central bank digital currency. Others say it would be useful for financial inclusion or competition with China, or just generally the world is getting more digital. We have to have this. Some oppose because they have this vision that, gee, does this mean the Fed will know every single transaction I make? I think there are ways to design it so that is not the case. But I think we're not likely to see much action by Congress on this in the near term. Finally, there are some administrative solutions, and I will let Howell talk about
Well,
those.
I want to make sure, what's our timing?
We go to
Till 1 o'clock. Okay. So there are administrative solutions, and it's actually good to have Tim and me up here since we probably are the leading proponents of administrative solutions, and we've written a series of papers about how current law could be used to perhaps address some of these issues. It would clearly be easiest to get legislation. As Tim indicated, legislation is difficult, especially if there's at a minimum a divided House and maybe more completely divided government. It might just be quite difficult to get consensus on these points. So I think that we probably shouldn't spend, given the time, not go into the details. But we basically have one idea about stable coins and how existing structures could be used to create a federal stablecoin vehicle. We would have to address all the issues that Tim mentioned, and those are difficult issues to do. But our view, at least, is administratively you could try to do that. It would require a lot of coordination and a cooperation amongst regulatory bodies, and that's actually one of the problems in the United States. Is the regulatory bodies don't coordinate together. You would sort of need to have the Federal Reserve and the OCC, the Comptroller of the Currency, the banking regulators get together, get the FDIC involved, maybe even getting the SEC involved. It could be done. We think it's a heavy lift, and there's some political choices that would be difficult. Most notably, do you let Facebook commercial companies get into it? You could structure it in a way that that's possible. You could also structure it in a way that it's not possible. Whichever choice you make, someone is going to be unhappy. So you'd have to have a will. You'd have to think that the business case for stable coins was strong enough to warrant it. And I think that's possible for the reasons Tim suggested. And you'd have to also be concerned that if you don't do something, it's just going to migrate off to tether offshore, and you're going to have the problems without any control. So there's an argument for doing it. We're looking at it. People are interested. The other article that we put together is on this, CFT. Is it a security? Is it a commodity? Which is it? Well, to some degree, the industry claims it wants regulation, but also is totally playing off the SEC and the CFTC against each other. So they're in some sense happy to have this division. It's either a security, or it's a commodity, or it's subject to CFPB jurisdiction as a payment thing. If somehow all three agencies could get together and coordinate, they should in theory be able to work this out. They're not good playing together. What our proposal is, though, is that the SEC and the CFTC create a joint SRO like FINRA, which regulates broker-dealers.
Self-regulatory
organization that would put together rules that work for crypto and then bring it into the regulatory umbrella that way. And actually, some of the legislation points in this direction. Maybe we should have an SRO. Our view is that actually there is authority for new SROs to be created, and they can be jointly overseen by both commissions. There actually is one example that Tim actually worked with when he was in charge. So there's, if you are a creative lawyer, you can find some solutions under existing law, but it requires cooperation. It requires leadership. In that smorgasbord of boxes that I had up on the board, it's not totally clear who's in charge. You know, the White House president runs the government, but a lot of these agencies are independent agencies. There is a group that Tim mentioned, the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, that actually is supposed to help coordinate, but it's got a lot of members and it's kind of cumbersome. The Treasury Department kind of has a lot of brain power and sort of thinks about financial policy, but it doesn't run the independent agencies either. And sometimes, weirdly, the Treasury doesn't agree with the White House, which you would think shouldn't happen. But in fact, it does. Well, Tim, I don't want to represent what you're going to say as a former official, but from the outset, I'll say it certainly seems like they don't always agree.
They don't always agree.
So I'll end where I began. It's complicated, but it's important. And one of the things that Tim said is, one strategy is just keep it outside of the rest of the financial system. And so we'll be insulated whatever bad things happen. Well, there's actually kind of interesting stories coming out today about, remind me again, who has positions in FTX? Well, it's BlackRock. It's names there is this kind of connection already between the markets. And I think the hope of complete segregation, absent sort of a PRC crackdown of the sort that I think is just incredibly unlikely, there is interconnectedness that we have to worry about. So with that, maybe we'll throw it over.
Yeah, and I think we can go a little bit past one. Is that right? At least in here?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
If you have questions, I will find you with this microphone.
And we can repeat the question.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Howell. I have a question about FTX, if I may. There is, I'm trying to find the tweets, but there was like tweet number 6, I believe. He was saying that I was under the impression that the leverage of the exchange is 0, and it turns out that the leverage of the exchange is 1.7. And I just don't understand like how the exchange could be leveraged.
I guess let me first answer it by saying I don't want to assume anything on Twitter is correct, because the facts will come out. But I guess your question is, how could an exchange be leveraged?
Yes. So like how's that? Yeah.
Just it incurs debt like any other entity. I guess I'm not.
Yeah.
Sure
So like how do we compare this to like other exchanges? Like
yeah. I don't know if I could answer.
Well, let me sort of. It does seem to be, and as Tim said, we don't really know. There were representations of one-to-one collateralization, and if that's true, then it's not totally clear how you have a liquidity crisis, because you have one-to-one. So there must somehow have been some sort of leverage going on. My guess is maybe lending the assets and getting some sort of, there's so many ways to do financial transactions that if you're not operating within a regulatory structure with a rule book, there's many ways. Tim used to be in the business of generating leverage through the swaps world, so he's one of the leading experts on how you might do that.
Right. Well, let me first say, when we're talking about an exchange, first of all, the assumption, as Hal says, is one-to-one. What we mean by that is, if I'm a customer and I have an account at the exchange has a liability to me for that amount. We're assuming the exchange has those assets on hand, and it's one-to-one. And there are audits and kind of reserve analyses that are done to make sure of that. As Hal said, the rumors, the allegations with FTX are that it used some of those customer assets to lend to an affiliate. Now, there's other ways exchanges might be leveraged. We're not yet talking about those, but normally exchanges don't have a whole lot of extra capital on top of just having those customer assets on hand. But I think with FTX, the main issue today that's out there that people are concerned about is, did it lend customer assets to its affiliate.
Right. And since people are making withdrawal requests
Yeah.
and they're not honoring them,
Right.
it makes me scratch my head to wonder.
Yes, and since apparently Sam Bankman-Fried was out trying to raise billions of dollars, and one wonders, was raising the money connected to having difficulty of meeting withdrawal requests, then you really wonder.
Yeah.
But the facts will come out eventually. Yeah.
Thank you both. This was very interesting. I don't know if the mic is working, but I can
Speak into it because I think that it is working.
Okay, amazing.
We'll repeat your question.
Amazing. So my question is, if we do end up regulating both stable coins and exchanges even more, this will of course apply in the US. And my guess is that everything would just then move to the Bahamas. And I think with stable coins, it's very difficult to do anything about it because they are decentralized. But with centralized exchanges, would it be possible to say that any exchange that has customers in the US and addresses customers in the US has to be regulated under US rules? Is this something that is legally possible?
Yeah, I mean, the jurisdictional questions are super interesting, but if you sell securities into the United States, if you're, a British company or a Chinese company or whatever company, and you sell to a US person, then that is subject to SEC regulation and everything applies. So if we decided these things are securities, there's similar kinds of rules for banking. It's a little puzzling to me how much offshore activity is coming into the United States from Tether. Now, some of these folks are working with some state affiliates that have money transmitter, licenses for some of the activities that's going on here, and the issuer is offshore. But I think, a robust regulatory system could deal with it. And I think if you were going to regulate, you have to deal with that, because otherwise everyone will just choose the Bahamas or Aruba or wherever is most congenial.
Makes sense. Thank you.
And the other thing I would say, we often have these issues in a global market, right, where there's some financial activity and people say, well, I mean, you can't just act in the US because then it'll just move offshore. The fact is, we have a global market, but we have nation states that set the rules. And my view is always on these issues, the US has to do what the US thinks is right. And hopefully other countries will follow. That's happened in other cases. In swaps, for example, we regulated swaps and other countries gradually came along. So,
and then sometimes we distinguish between foreign countries.
Yeah.
Countries have systems that are, substantially equivalent to ours. We may say, well, those can come in or not. I mean, there's 100 ways of dealing with cross-border issues of harmonization or other things, but clearly there's legal authority.
An issue here is that an exchange could also be decentralized completely, right? And a stable coin could be decentralized. Well, probably not, but perhaps partially. So in that case, how could you?
Well, I think there's still ways, even with stable coins, because if you pass a law that says you're prohibited from, issuing or transferring a stable coin in the U.S. unless it's issued by a regulated provider, then people aren't going to use that stable coin, right?
Right.
But one thing that's true about DeFi and a lot of stuff on the chain, we have a regulatory system that sort of presupposes there is an issuer or there's a legal element, and it's more of a challenge when what you're just talking about is a couple lines of code is sort of the thing, and getting a hold of it is, can be difficult.
Thank you.
You want to hand it back?
So, there's any discussion about regulating these currencies from the perspective of monetary policy. It sounds like new cryptocurrency sounds like creating new money, and then if stablecoin is purchased exchanged with other fiat, then it sounds like creating a new foreign exchange market. So, could you comment on that?
Yeah, it sounds like money. In fact, there's a great article that's coming out that analogizes stablecoins to the era of wildcat banking in the first half of the 19th century, when there was a lot of banks running around with kind of unstable currencies. So that's a lens. When we say run, we're kind of invoking bank-like talk. You know, if it's a narrow stable coin of the sort that Tim was alluding to, where all the money goes into the Fed or is in treasuries, it's a little bit less bank-like. But you know, it's totally true that if you go to the Fed and you talk to the monetary policy folks, they are definitely concerned that if this becomes a major monetary asset, it could be problematic. You know, interestingly, and Tim often tells the story, China sort of worries about the same thing with the US dollar stablecoin, but in the opposite direction. They worry that it's going to generate further dollar dominance. And so they've been developing their own stuff. But yeah, the monetary policy implications of stablecoins and also central bank digital currencies themselves are pretty serious. And if you read the Fed report that Tim alluded to, at least on the central bank digital currency side, half of the concerns the Fed has is it implications for monetary policy and also financial stability, which are kind of related concepts.
Yeah, and there are some people who think we need to develop a central bank digital currency to basically prevent or eliminate the need for private stablecoins, and to, you know, maintain control over monetary policy. Other questions? Should stand up.
So I'll take the prerogative of the whatever I am in this context. Certainly, this is not my area of expertise, but in your paper, when you were talking about stable coins, one of the things you raised was creating an insured depository institution of some sort. And can you talk a little bit about, I mean, that sounds to me like very banking kind of terminology. And are you know, would the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency kind of authorize this bank charter, and how would that play out in terms of like fractional reserve banking and things like that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ideas that are going on. Let me just do this.
Sorry.
So the basic idea that we had, as John was alluding to, of the National Trust Bank setting up with a trust instrument, sort of a remote place to put the assets, to deal precisely with the one-to-one problem. We were going to kind of make sure that there was one-to-one assets and they'd have to be super safe. So kind of like a money market mutual fund, but in a bank structure, which gives it the advantage of you know, kind of being a federal entity that might preempt state law. It also means that the FDIC could do a receivership. So if we got into an FTX situation, it wouldn't be the bankruptcy court with everything stayed. It would sort of be designed to keep the payment system going. So, you know, this is the piece about how to make it work. Now, John mentioned, you said something about an insured depository institution, and that's totally right. We put the insured depository institution on top as a requirement. We tried to make it as insulated as possible from the insured depository institution, but we put the insured depository institution on top because that means it couldn't affiliate with commerce. We're kind of bringing in the Bank Holding Company Act by doing that. And that's because we didn't want to rock the boat and let Facebook come in. We thought that if you're going to do this administratively, that's something you don't want to take on.
Yeah.
When we were writing this paper, every week on Friday, Tim would call me up and say, let's get rid of the
I would
IDI
take the
piece.
question of what's the role of like a Facebook, and the guys that we were on a call with some people on a Hoover institution, Stanford thing, and the Meta guys were complaining that there wasn't a regulatory structure, and they really had the perfect, you know.
Yeah.
But the other reason we have the insured depository institution up there was that's where the Biden administration was in its views toward what it would allow.
Exactly.
And we wanted to offer a proposal that would be acceptable to them.
Right. When they wrote their November report from a year ago, they said stablecoin should be within insured depository institutions. And to us, and maybe channel a little bit what John was saying, it was really? you want to put them inside the bank, right next to the insured deposit? Are you saying you want them insured? And, you know, I have a former student who's a great lawyer now, and actually he's working for a client. Yeah, he wants to put stable coins inside of the bank and get them insured and just kind of have, he thinks of them more like, well, just a new kind of check.
Yeah.
It will be a
Tokenized
blockchain
deposit.
check,
Right.
or blockchain check. And, you know, that's another vision. That wasn't our vision. And,
Right.
but when Tim kind of alluded to the 22 report that the administration put out from FSOC, they kind of, they were like Tim on Fridays. They kind of seemed to suggest that maybe we could go that route and have kind of a general purpose vehicle, which is, you know,
The other thing to understand about this is payments today are done basically by banks, right? We bundle the payment function, the credit creation function. And there are those who would say, well, that's why our payment system isn't as good as it is in other countries, because we haven't had enough competition. We need to have competition for the banks. And stablecoins could do that. So then when the Biden administration said, okay, we could have stablecoins, but they got to be by banks, those people said, well, wait a minute, that kind of defeats the whole point.
So the banks like you to use your credit cards, and you all used your credit cards to buy stuff because they give you 1% back for your frequent flyers, but they keep 2%. So they're making a ton of money on your credit cards, and that's why maybe the United States has not innovated in the way Europe. A lot of countries have more efficient payments than we do.
Yeah. Another question? Anyone? Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Oh, hi, and thanks again. I have a quick question. I'm not an expert, but my understanding of a big part of this debate was whether the decentralized finance should also be regulated, or should regulation focus more on like centralized finance and exchanges and traders, basically. And what I heard this morning regarding the FTX debacle is that apparently people who were in decentralized finance were left unscratched. So I don't know if you have any views on that. They were, their money was kept safe. So I'm not sure if you have any.
So the decentralized did
Right.
better than the
Yes, right.
Yeah.
We will see that argument over the next few days a lot, I think.
Mhm.
Right.
So should decentralized finance be kept away like from regulation? It should be needed for
I
regulation?
don't think so
or
from a consumer protection point of view, or even from a financial stability point of view. You, as a consumer, you know, you could face basically all the same risks trading on a decentralized platform as you could on an exchange if you don't know exactly how the procedures work, or if, you know, the code isn't good, or, you know, if there's other problems. I mean, it's a slightly different set of problems because it is a code, right? You know, it's not a company, but I don't think it should be free of regulation. I mean, I was on a phone call this morning with the former chairman of the SEC, Jay Clayton, and he said, you know, every retail financial product that you deal with is regulated in some way. It's only because this space could grow in a way that it wasn't clear who could regulate it that we're in this situation. So the challenge of that, you know, it's difficult to figure out how exactly to regulate the DeFi platforms, because there isn't a corporate entity where you can say, you have to do this. We've said in our paper, well, that's why we need this self-regulatory organization in part, because bring the industry in and make them figure it out.
All right, terrific. We're at the witching hour. I want to thank both Howell and Tim.
Thank you.